It was once said that the only thing that evil needs to win is for good people to do nothing. Now, when we talk about the civil rights movement, oftentimes this gets sort of sewn together as Martin Luther King Jr.'s movement. And I think that misunderstands the role Martin Luther King Jr. played in the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was an organizer and he was a spokesperson for the movement, but the civil rights movement would have failed if it was just him. It took the efforts of hundreds of thousands of people joining together to protest in this nonviolent civil disobedient manner to achieve the gains that it did throughout the 50s and early 60s. The civil rights movement, because of the method that it used, was able to gain presidential support under Truman in his efforts to desegregate the military. Then later, under the Kennedy administration, as you saw previously, when Kennedy was tried to support a civil rights amendment and later a voting rights amendment, Lyndon Johnson was largely pushed through no desire really to do civil rights, but just because of public opinion, to support the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And we'll talk more about those later. But it's the people's involvement in these movements that forces the legislation, because politicians didn't really want to do anything. The national politicians were worried about making sure they got election results in the South. So it was this overwhelming media presence and this overwhelming show of popular support that led to things like the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act in the mid-60s to be passed. An important element of history is understanding that things change over time. There's an evolution of ideas, and especially within even political parties. And one thing that's really frustrating is when people don't understand the historic nature of politics. Yes, it is true that the KKK used to be associated with the Democratic Party, right? During Reconstruction, the KKK was the militant wing of the party. However, it's also true that Republicans at the time were the party of Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator. This changes over time, largely as a result of the civil rights movement. In 1948, when Harry Truman advocated for desegregating the military and anti-lynching laws, there was a group of Democrats that split off from the Democratic Party known as the Dixiecrats. And the Dixiecrats, their whole purpose was to promote segregation and fight integration in 1948. So this goes on even further during the Kennedy administration, later in Lyndon Johnson's administration. When Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which had been proposed under Kennedy, he said that the Democratic Party has lost the South for a generation, meaning that those Dixiecrats, those white supremacists, would not support the Democratic Party at that point. It goes even further because Richard Nixon recognized this. Nixon is a Republican. Nixon recognized this and promised to limit the civil rights impact in return for gaining white votes in the South. This is called the Southern Strategy. So the nature of the parties does shift over time, and a lot of it is a result of the backlash to the civil rights movement in the United States during the 1960s. The civil rights movement made a lot of great gains all the way up until the mid-60s. It reached its pinnacle in '64 with the Civil Rights Act, and then in '65 with the Voting Rights Act. These were easy, visible symbols of racism in the country. And once African Americans and other minorities got those rights, it was very easy for the rest of the country to write off the gains. Because the focus shifts away from ending segregation because that's been done. And it shifts away from the voting rights because that's been achieved. And it moves on to far more difficult things. Things like economic inequality, social inequality, systematic racism, as opposed to individual racism. It's very easy to show Bull Connor in Birmingham using fire hoses on African Americans. It's much more difficult to show the subtle racism of something like redlining outside of Philadelphia, where African Americans were not allowed to, not able to get mortgages to buy a home, to build up family wealth, which set them back generations. It's much harder to show that. So what ends up happening is that the gains of the mid-60s start to wither away in the late 60s as general public support starts to fall away, there was a mentality of, what are you complaining about? We gave you civil rights. We gave you voting rights. Um, it's in this stew, in this atmosphere of de facto segregation, that the new Black Power movement starts to have more of a voice. It had been there for a long time. Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, these were, and others, the Black Panther Party, had been fighting for civil rights in a more aggressive manner, even during the nonviolent civil disobedience movement. But now they started to take on even more of a visible show. It's in this era that we start to see urban riots in places like Detroit and Watts. And when the urban riots are being shown on television, we have almost the opposite effect of what was happening with the TV being used for civil rights movement. People started looking at the urban riots and starting getting upset and not understanding why these people, in quotes, have to do this. So the riots and the urban rhetoric undermine that broad public support for civil rights. And without the broad public support, the politicians don't feel like they need to do anything. So they start to lose, the civil rights movement starts to lose the legislative steam that it had had. But be careful, the Black Power movement wasn't just about by any means necessary and violent attacks. It was also more of an empowerment movement. This is where the Black is Beautiful movement also comes in. So it's more of a Black pride thing. So the civil rights movement becomes much more complicated, and we're still feeling the effects even today with something like the Black Lives Matter movement of that late 60s period and the unfulfilled civil rights movement. The civil rights movement also helped bring forth the women's rights movement. As women participated in the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s, they realized that they could use the same organizational strategies to push for their rights and interests. So we have organizations like the National Organization of Women Fighting to help promote legislation that would support their interests. You have people like Betty Friedan publishing books. Friedan's most famous book is called The Feminine Mystique. The Feminine Mystique argues that women do not need to be in the house having children to be happy, that they can have careers, that they can go out into the world and be just as fulfilled being their own individual, trying to reach their own goals, as they can simply being housewives. In the 1964, the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 also included gender discrimination laws. This is where we get Title IX that allows women's and men's sports to have equality in schools. This is the era where we get Roe versus Wade. Now, Roe v. Wade is a very controversial law. I don't want to get into that. But it provides reproductive rights, essentially allowing abortion during the first trimester, some limited abortion during the second trimester of a pregnancy, but bans it in the third trimester. When you combine Roe versus Wade with the now available birth control pill of the 1960s, women have much more ability to control their own reproductive abilities. In the 1960s and 70s, we also have an Equal Rights Amendment passed because of the efforts of women's rights groups. So the ERA ultimately is going to be defeated by more conservative members of the country. Additionally, some women like Phyllis Schlafly were opposed to the ERA. But we can see that there's a radical move away from what's sometimes called the cult of true womanhood, or the cult of domesticity, where women are expected to be in the home, now to one that's a little bit more liberating and women have more options and abilities. Again, this is a movement that we're still in the process of completing, but it's there. And it's not just women. During the Civil Rights Movement, Native Americans and Latinos and other groups are attempting to gain their rights.